It was late September of 1998 when I drove up north to my grandmother's old cabin in the woods of northern Michigan. The cabin had been in our family for years, but after my grandmother passed away that winter, nobody really went up there much. It sat empty, tucked back into a cluster of birch and pine trees near a slow-moving river. The place wasn't modern at all. No electricity except for a noisy generator. No running water besides the old hand pump by the porch, and no real road leading to it, just a dirt track with weeds and stones. I was 27 at the time, and I had been working long shifts at the plant. My mind was tired, and I thought a weekend alone at the cabin might give me some peace. It was already getting dark when I arrived. The air was cool, and the smell of wet leaves clung heavy in the woods. I carried my bags inside and looked around. The furniture was the same as when my grandmother had lived there. The heavy wooden rocking chair by the fireplace, the faded rug with frayed edges, the small table with the oil lamp on top. Everything smelled like old cedar mixed with dust. The strange part was how untouched it looked, almost like she had just stepped outside. Her knitting basket was still beside the chair, needles stuck in a half-finished scarf. A chipped coffee mug was on the counter, turned upside down to dry. For a moment, it made my chest feel tight, like I had walked into the past. I told myself I just needed to relax, settle in, and get used to being alone in that quiet place. That night, it rained. The sound of water hitting the roof was steady, almost calming. I lit the oil lamp, sat at the table, and wrote in a notebook I had brought with me. Around midnight, the wind picked up and branches knocked against the siding. I was about to blow out the lamp when I caught a whiff of something sharp, like rot. At first, I thought maybe it was a dead animal under the cabin. The smell was faint but sour, not like the musty odor of dust or mold. It made my stomach tighten. I tried to ignore it. I blew out the lamp, stretched out on the old couch, and pulled the blanket over me. But the smell seemed to grow thicker as the night went on. It clung to my nose, sickly sweet and heavy. I turned over again and again, unable to sleep. The cabin groaned with the wind, and every creak made me more aware of how alone I was. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the smell hadn't. It lingered, almost stronger in daylight. I stepped outside, breathing in the cool air to clear my head. The ground was muddy, leaves plastered flat in the dirt. I walked around the cabin, looking for any sign of a dead raccoon or deer. I checked under the porch, kicked at the brush pile, even walked to the edge of the trees. Nothing. When I came back inside, the smell hit me hard, stronger than before. It wasn't outside, it was inside. My chest felt heavy. I opened the single window, let some air in, and walked from room to room. The cabin wasn't big, just 2 small bedrooms and the main room with the fireplace. I checked under the beds, pulled open closets, lifted the lid of the old wooden trunk by the wall. Nothing unusual, but when I got to the bedroom my grandmother had always used, the smell nearly knocked me back. I stood in the doorway, the air thick, sharp, undeniable. My hands felt clammy. I remembered that after she passed, her body hadn't been found for a few days. She had died in her sleep one cold night, and by the time someone checked on her, she was gone. But she had been buried back in town in the cemetery. I had been at the funeral. That was real. I kept reminding myself of that. Still, something in that room felt wrong. The bed was made, the quilt tucked tight, the pillows fluffed. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the smell, it seemed to seep out from somewhere deeper. I opened the dresser drawers, empty except for a few folded shirts. I crouched to check under the bed again, shining my small flashlight. That's when I noticed the floorboards near the back corner looked different. The wood was slightly darker, like it had been pulled up once and then set back. My chest tightened as I crouched lower. The nails on that section of the floor looked newer than the rest, shiny silver against old wood. I hesitated, but the smell seemed to push me forward. My hands trembled as I worked at the edge with my pocket knife, prying one nail loose, then another. The board lifted with a groan, and a gush of stale, heavy air poured out. I gagged, covering my mouth with my sleeve. I forced myself to look. Inside the narrow crawl space beneath the floor, wrapped in a torn old blanket, was a body. The skin was dried, yellowed, the hair thin and gray. I froze, my whole body locked stiff. My brain couldn't make sense of it. My grandmother had been buried. So who was this? My heart hammered so hard I felt it in my throat. I pulled the lamp closer and studied the face. It wasn't completely gone, though the skin had shrunk tight over the bones. The nose, the chin, my blood went cold. It was her. It was my grandmother's body, hidden under the cabin floor. I stumbled back, falling against the dresser. My hands shook uncontrollably. The smell was unbearable now, swirling around me, thick and clinging. I ran outside, bent over in the dirt, and vomited until my stomach was empty. I sat there in the cold morning air, gasping, my mind racing. If she was buried in town, then what was this? Had the funeral been a closed casket? I tried to remember, but all I could picture was the polished wood box, the flowers, the dirt falling over it. No one had seen her body. We had just trusted what the funeral home told us. I sat on the porch for hours, staring at the trees, unable to move. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The cabin, the woods, everything around me felt different, darker, like I was trapped inside something I wasn't supposed to find. When I finally stood up, I knew I couldn't stay there another night. I packed quickly, my movements jerky and rushed. I didn't even bother to lock the door. As I loaded the car, I kept glancing back at the cabin, at that dark window where the smell had seeped out. My grandmother had lived there for decades, and all this time, her body had been hidden beneath the floor. The drive back to town was long, and every mile felt heavy. I couldn't stop thinking about the funeral, about how no one had asked questions. I thought about my uncle, the one who had handled most of the arrangements, the one who had keys to the cabin. My throat felt dry, my thoughts twisting in circles I didn't want to follow. When I reached town, I didn't go home right away. I drove straight to the sheriff's office. I walked in, pale and shaking, and told them what I had found. They sent people up there that same evening. Later, I heard that they pulled the body out, confirmed it was her. The truth came out slowly, like pieces of a puzzle you didn't want to finish. My uncle had never taken her to the funeral home. He had told the family a story, arranged for a closed casket, and kept her hidden under the cabin for reasons nobody could fully understand. Money, maybe, or something darker. I never went back to that cabin again. Still stands there, I think, but it's not mine anymore. When I close my eyes, I can still see the dark corner of that room, the floorboard lifting, and the smell that filled my lungs. I went there for peace, but instead I left with something I'll never shake for the rest of my life. I was 28 when I decided to take the long drive out to the edge of northern Pennsylvania in the fall of 1996. The reason was simple on the surface but complicated in my head. I had been feeling restless living in the small city, surrounded by noise, neighbors, and the same old routines. A friend of mine had told me about a forgotten piece of land that his uncle used to own, a patch of woods near an old graveyard. There was a cabin there, abandoned for years, still standing but leaning, with no electricity and no proper road leading to it anymore. I didn't know exactly why, but I wanted to see it. I told myself I'd only spend a night or two, just to clear my head, maybe write in my journal, and try to feel like I wasn't boxed in by concrete and traffic. The drive itself took almost 5 hours. By the time I turned off the paved roads onto a dirt path that had nearly been swallowed by weeds and saplings, The sun was already low. The air was crisp, the kind of sharp chill that made you breathe deeper without meaning to. The trees were thick and tall, pressing close to the narrow track. When I finally saw the clearing, the cabin was there, dark, weather-beaten wood, the roof sagging a little, the porch steps warped and half-broken. Behind it, further down the slope, was the graveyard my friend had mentioned. I hadn't realized it would be so close. From where I stood in front of the cabin, I could already see the stones jutting out of the ground like crooked teeth. The graveyard wasn't large, maybe 30-40 graves at most. Most of the headstones were cracked, tilted, or sunken halfway into the dirt. Moss and vines covered many of them. The names were so faded that you had to squint to make out even a few letters. It wasn't the kind of place anyone visited anymore. No flowers, no flags, no signs of care. Just silence, the kind of silence that settles heavy in your chest. Inside the cabin, the air smelled like rot and damp wood. The floor creaked with every step, and in one corner, a raccoon or something had torn apart old boxes, leaving shreds of paper and cloth scattered. There was a single table still standing, uneven but solid enough. 2 chairs sat near it, one with a missing leg. A small wood stove was rusted shut in the corner. The windows were caked with grime, making the already fading daylight seem dimmer. I set down my pack, unrolled my sleeping bag, and sat on the floor against the wall. As the evening came on, I kept finding my eyes drifting back to the graveyard. It wasn't that I believed in anything supernatural. I didn't. But the thought of lying down to sleep with a field of old graves less than 50 yards away gave me a crawling unease I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the quiet was playing tricks. Still, I decided to build a small fire outside, just for the light and warmth. The fire cracked and popped as the woods darkened around me. The sky turned a deep gray, then black, and the moon rose pale through the trees. I walked down closer to the graveyard, just to look. The stones cast long, jagged shadows across the ground. The soil between them was uneven, some parts sunken as if the earth had collapsed underneath. A thin mist had begun to form, curling low around the bases of the stones. It was colder there, noticeably colder, enough that I pulled my jacket tighter. That was when I noticed something odd. Near the back corner of the graveyard, where the ground dipped slightly, the earth looked disturbed. Not fresh exactly, but not as settled as the other graves. The dirt was looser, darker, like it had been dug at some point not too long ago. There was no marker above it, no stone, just a shallow rectangular dip. I stood staring at it for a long time, my stomach tightening. I tried to tell myself animals had done it, maybe digging for shelter. But the shape was too clean, too sharp at the edges. It looked deliberate. I went back to the cabin and tried to distract myself by writing in my notebook, but I couldn't stop thinking about that patch of ground. When I finally stretched out in my sleeping bag, the noises of the forest seemed louder than before. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush felt close. Too close. Around midnight, I heard something that made me sit up fully. Footsteps. Not the scurrying of animals, not the flutter of wings. These were heavier, uneven, moving slowly across the clearing outside. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps crunched against the dried leaves, stopped, then started again. They seemed to circle near the graveyard, then closer to the cabin. I felt my throat tighten as I realized I hadn't locked the warped front door. Not that the lock would have held anyway. My pulse hammered in my ears. I told myself it could be a deer, but deep down I knew deer don't walk like that. The steps faded after a while, but sleep never came to me. I just sat there, clutching the flashlight I had in my bag, waiting. When dawn finally broke, pale light leaking through the grime-streaked windows, I went outside. The fire had died down to cold ash. I walked carefully toward the graveyard, scanning the ground. That's when I saw them, footprints. Clear, pressed deep into the damp earth near the graves. Not animal prints. Shoes. Heavy, worn shoes. The prints led directly to that disturbed patch of soil at the far end, circled it, and then turned back into the woods. My stomach dropped as I crouched to look closer. The prints weren't mine. The size was bigger, the tread different. And they weren't old, the edges were still sharp. Someone else had been there in the night, walking among the graves, standing right where I had seen that disturbed ground. I stood there for a long time, staring into the trees where the prints disappeared. I realized how foolish it had been to come here alone, with no phone signal, no way to call for help. Whoever had been there could have been watching me the whole time, standing in the dark while I sat by my fire. The thought made me feel sick. I packed up quickly, stuffing everything into my bag without care. The unease had turned into a sharp edge of fear. I didn't bother trying to eat or clean up. I just wanted to leave. Before I left, though, I glanced once more at that dip in the earth. In the daylight, I could see something I had missed the night before. A corner of dark fabric was poking out from the soil, barely visible but there. I didn't go closer. I didn't need to. I knew then that the graveyard wasn't just old stones and forgotten names. Someone had been using it recently, and they had been there while I slept, moving through the dark, close enough to reach me if they had wanted. I left the cabin behind me, my hands tight on the steering wheel the whole drive back. Even hours later, when I was finally on the highway surrounded by other cars, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints circling the grave. Whoever they belonged to, they hadn't just been passing through. They had a reason for being there, and I had nearly stumbled right into it. I never went back. And to this day, when I think about that patch of earth and the fabric sticking out of the dirt, I know I made the right choice. Some things are better left unseen, and some places should stay abandoned. I had not been down that old road in years, not since the divorce. It wasn't even a real road anymore, more like a half-forgotten track of dirt and gravel that led into the woods. The county had stopped grading it long ago, and nature had been taking it back little by little. Weeds grew thick on the edges, grass pushed through cracks of dirt, and potholes were filled with muddy rainwater that reflected the gray sky. That morning, I had no reason to drive past it. I had taken a wrong turn after leaving the grocery store outside of town. I figured I'd cut through the back roads instead of circling back, thinking I remembered the way. As soon as I saw the turn, I felt my stomach drop. It was like someone had opened a drawer I'd shoved shut years ago and didn't want to look in. That road went to my ex-husband's cabin, the place where I had spent 5 years of my life. 5 years that started with excitement and ended with exhaustion. He still owned it as far as I knew, though after the divorce I hadn't asked a single thing about it. I told myself I'd just pass by and keep going. The road bent around a thick patch of pines, and as soon as I turned the wheel, the air inside the car felt heavier. My dog, Max, was sitting in the back seat. He was a large shepherd mix, calm most of the time, but his ears perked up the second we hit that stretch of road. His head went to the window, sniffing hard, then he gave a low whine. The trees here grew taller, denser, leaning over the road as if they were closing me in. The sunlight barely cut through, even though it wasn't late yet. The closer I got to the cabin, the more I could feel something crawling under my skin. It wasn't ghosts or anything like that. It was just the memories. The sound of him chopping wood in the evenings, the creak of that old porch when he'd pace back and forth smoking his cigarettes, the fights that had filled the walls. I slowed the car when the roof of the cabin came into view through the trees. The place looked worse than I expected. The paint had peeled down to bare wood in long strips. The roof sagged where the heavy snow must have pressed it year after year. The windows were dark, a couple of them cracked, and the porch looked close to collapsing. Max started barking, sharp and loud. He almost never barked in the car. His whole body stiffened, his eyes locked on the cabin. The sound echoed off the trees, and I felt my chest tighten. I told myself he probably smelled an animal. That made sense. That cabin had always drawn raccoons, stray cats, even deer that would walk right up when it was quiet. Still, I slowed almost to a stop, my hands tightening on the wheel. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. I let the car creep forward until the cabin sat fully in view. That's when I noticed the door. It was wide open. The memory of that door was burned in my mind. It had always stuck, even in summer when the wood swelled, and you had to yank hard to pull it open. He used to slam it so often the frame cracked near the lock. Now, though, it hung crooked, wide enough that I could see into the dark inside. Max growled, a low rumble in his throat. He shifted in the seat, his paws pressing against the glass, eyes fixed on that doorway. I couldn't see anything in the shadows, just empty black. My first thought was that someone was living there. Squatters, maybe, or some hunter using it without permission. I thought about just driving on, but the feeling in my gut wouldn't let me. Something about it was wrong. I pulled the car over onto the weeds at the side of the road and cut the engine. The sudden quiet was thick, only broken by Max's breathing. I sat there for a long time, staring through the windshield, trying to decide what to do. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. Somewhere far off a crow called, and the wind carried the sound. But near the cabin it was too quiet. No bugs buzzing, no rustle of small animals. Just stillness. Finally, I opened the door. Max leapt out before I even had the chance to grab his leash, circling around the car, ears pointed forward, fur standing slightly along his neck. He moved toward the cabin a few steps, then stopped and looked back at me as if waiting. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove box. Even though it was still daytime, the woods and the inside of that cabin looked darker than they should. My boots sank slightly in the soft dirt as I walked up the path, weeds brushing against my legs. Each step felt like it took too much effort, like the air itself was heavier here. When I reached the porch, I could see more clearly inside. The smell hit first, a sour, rotten smell, thick and wet. It was the smell of mold, maybe animals, maybe both. Max wouldn't step onto the porch. He stood at the bottom, growling deep, his tail stiff. I aimed the flashlight into the doorway. Dust floated in the beam, and the walls inside were stained and peeling. The old couch where I used to sit was still there, slumped and covered in filth. Something dark stained the floor near the edge of the rug. At first I thought it was water damage, but it looked too dark, too uneven. I didn't step inside, couldn't. The smell was too strong, and every instinct I had screamed to turn back. I just stood there, looking, the memories pressing down hard. Then I saw the tracks. In the layer of dust near the doorway, there were clear footprints. Not old ones, not faded. Fresh. They led out of the cabin, down the porch, and stopped right at the edge where I stood. My throat tightened. The prints were larger than mine. Bare feet pressed into the dust, toes spread wide. Whoever it was, they had walked out recently. Very recently. Max barked again, sharp and frantic this time, spinning in a circle like he was trying to find where the scent went. I backed off the porch quickly, my heart slamming in my chest. I looked into the trees around me, but the undergrowth was thick. If someone was out there watching, I wouldn't see them. I didn't wait to find out. I turned fast, calling Max. He bolted ahead of me, pulling toward the car. I got in, slammed the door, and started the engine with shaking hands. Gravel spit out from under the tires as I turned the car back down the road, away from the cabin. Even as I drove, I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. But no one did, just the trees closing in. I didn't stop driving until I was back on the main road. My chest hurt from how tight I'd been holding my breath. Max finally lay back down in the seat, though his ears stayed up, eyes fixed on the rear window until the cabin road was far behind us. I never told anyone what I saw. Maybe someone had broken in and was living there, maybe worse. But I knew one thing for certain. Whoever left those footprints had been standing right where I stood, and they were still out there when I drove away. I never took that back road again. I remember the summer of 1998 like it happened yesterday. I was 33 years old, living in Ohio, and had just gone through a rough stretch in life. I needed time away from people, noise, and the constant grind of work. A friend of mine mentioned a small, old cabin in northern Michigan that he hadn't used in years. He gave me the keys and directions, told me it wasn't fancy, but it would do for anyone who wanted to be left alone. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive took me nearly 9 hours. By the time I crossed into Michigan, I was already tired, but I remember how the road narrowed the further north I went. Wide highways turned into 2-lane roads, then dirt paths. The trees thickened, tall pines pressing in close to the gravel. I had the windows down and could hear nothing but the crunch of my tires and the wind slipping through the leaves. The cabin was tucked far back, past a bend, hidden like it didn't want to be found. It was smaller than I expected, built from rough wood that had darkened with age. The roof sagged a little, but it was still holding together. The porch boards creaked when I stepped onto them, and the whole place smelled faintly of damp earth and pine sap. Inside, it was simple. One room with a fireplace, a kitchen space with old appliances, and a small bedroom off to the side. There was no electricity, just a gas lantern, and no running water besides a pump outside. It was old-fashioned, but I liked that. I felt like I could breathe. For the first 2 days, it was quiet. I spent my time cutting wood, walking the trails, and writing in a notebook. I slept early because once the sun went down, the woods turned black, and the silence felt heavy. I wasn't used to that kind of darkness. In the city, even at night, there's a faint glow in the sky from streetlights and signs. Here, there was nothing but the stars. On the third night, things changed. I woke up sometime after midnight. I didn't know why at first, but then I realized I was listening. There was a sound outside, faint, steady. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal rustling. It was sharper, more deliberate. It sounded like footsteps on gravel, slow and careful. I held my breath. The sound came closer, then stopped, then started again. I sat up in bed, staring at the window, though it was too dark to see anything. After a while, it stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe just my nerves. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked the ground around the cabin. The dirt was soft from rain earlier that week, and I could see marks. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, but when I bent down, I saw they weren't. They were footprints, human, bare feet. The prints circled the cabin, stopping near the windows and the back door. A cold feeling ran through me, but I tried to explain it away. Maybe someone was living out in the woods, maybe just a drifter. It was strange, sure, but not impossible. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin, keeping busy with chopping and stacking wood. I made sure to check that the doors and windows were secure. That night, I stayed awake longer. I lit the lantern and sat in the chair by the fireplace, listening. Hours passed, and I almost convinced myself nothing would happen. But then I heard it again. Slow steps, crunching gravel, circling. This time, they didn't stop at the windows. They pressed right up against the porch. I heard the wood groan like someone was testing the boards. I gripped the handle of the axe I'd left by the door, my hands sweating. The footsteps moved around to the back, then faded into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I walked around again. More prints, clearer this time. They weren't large, maybe the size of a teenager's foot. That almost made it worse. A grown man I could have imagined as some drifter, but bare feet circling a cabin in the woods? That felt wrong. On the 5th day, I thought about leaving, packing up and driving back to Ohio. But part of me didn't want to give up. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I was blowing it out of proportion. So I stayed. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and sat waiting with the axe across my lap. The lantern threw shadows across the walls, and every small creak of the cabin made me tense. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. The slow crunch of footsteps. This time, they didn't circle. They came straight to the porch. I heard breathing, faint but clear, just beyond the door. Then, a soft press against the wood like a hand sliding over it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. The doorknob rattled. Not violently, just a slow turn, testing. That's when I finally shouted, banging the axe against the floorboards, making as much noise as I could. The sound stopped. Silence pressed in heavy. Then the steps retreated, fading back into the trees. I didn't sleep at all. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things fast and loaded up the car. Before leaving, I walked around the back one last time. That's when I saw it. Scratched into the wood of the cabin wall, just below the bedroom window, were letters. Crooked, uneven letters, like they were carved with a nail or a knife. It read, "I watch." That was it for me. I drove out of there as fast as I could, the gravel kicking up in the rearview mirror until the cabin disappeared behind the trees. I never told my friend what I saw, and I never went back. To this day, I don't know who was out there. Maybe it was just some local messing with me. Maybe someone had been living in those woods, watching, waiting. All I know is that those footprints, that breathing at the door, and those words carved into the wall are still burned into my memory. I thought going out there would give me peace, but it did the opposite. Sometimes, even now, if I wake in the middle of the night, I find myself listening for footsteps outside my window. And every time I do, I think about that cabin, and I remember the feeling of being watched by someone who never wanted me there in the first place. I had been driving for hours on that late autumn evening. The sky pressed low and gray above the empty stretch of highway. The air outside was damp, the kind that clung to your clothes and hair the moment you stepped out. My dog, Max, was curled up in the passenger seat, his head pressed against the door. He was a large shepherd mix, always alert, always watching, even when he looked asleep. I had planned this trip for weeks. 3 days alone in a cabin tucked deep in the forest of northern Michigan. No work emails, no constant traffic, no noise except the trees and the water. That was what I wanted. Solitude. The cabin was old, not falling apart but not modern either. It sat about a mile down a dirt track that barely looked like a road. When I pulled in, my tires crunched over wet gravel and leaves, and I had to lean forward in my seat to even spot the roof through the tree line. It was small, just 2 rooms and a porch that sagged slightly under its own weight. Still, it looked solid enough, the kind of place where you'd expect to find a stack of firewood already waiting and a faint smell of mildew inside. It was already close to dark when I unloaded. The air in the woods felt heavier than the highway, like the trees absorbed sound. Max sniffed around the porch and then stuck close to my side when I unlocked the door. Inside smelled exactly as I imagined, with smoke, damp earth, and something faintly metallic, like rust. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked through, turning on the small battery lantern I had brought since the place didn't have electricity. By the time I got my things inside, night had settled fully. The forest outside was black, the kind of black where you couldn't even see the shape of the trees anymore. I fed Max, made myself a sandwich from the cooler, and sat at the little wooden table in the center of the room. For a while it was peaceful, the sound of Max chewing and the occasional groan of the cabin as it adjusted to the drop in temperature. I almost convinced myself it would be exactly the quiet break I needed. But around midnight, Max lifted his head and let out a low growl. His ears were forward, his body stiff, his eyes focused on the door like something was standing just outside. I froze with the lantern dim on the table, my own breathing suddenly loud. I listened hard, every muscle locked in place, but at first I heard nothing. Only the wind brushing against the outside wall. Then, faintly, there was the crunch of leaves. Slow, measured, like someone walking in a half-circle around the cabin. I told myself it had to be an animal. A deer maybe, a raccoon nosing through old trash. Max didn't believe that. His growl deepened until he stood, teeth bared, his body pressed against the door. The sound outside stopped. Silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Then there was the sharp snap of a branch breaking under weight. Not the kind of sound a squirrel makes. Heavier, closer. I stayed awake most of the night after that. Every time I started to drift, Max would stiffen again, and I'd jolt back awake, staring at the windows where the lantern light reflected against the glass. At some point, I realized I was clutching the handle of my knife, gripping it so hard my hand hurt. When dawn finally broke, pale and weak through the clouds, I was still sitting upright, Max half asleep against my leg, but his ears twitching at every distant sound. The day should have made me feel better. But when I stepped outside with Max to let him stretch, I saw footprints in the mud near the porch. Not boot prints, but shoes. Regular sneakers. The treads were clear in the damp soil, leading from the tree line, circling half the cabin, and then disappearing back into the woods. They weren't mine, and they weren't from any hiker passing through. No one came out this far unless they meant to. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. I walked Max down to the river a few hundred yards away, but I couldn't relax. My head kept turning, scanning the tree line, waiting for movement. Every snapped twig set me on edge. By the time I got back, I decided I'd leave in the morning. Maybe it was all in my head, but I didn't care. Solitude wasn't worth this gnawing pit in my stomach. That night, it started again. Max stiffened at the door just after dark, his growl low but constant this time. I killed the lantern, figuring if anyone was out there, I wasn't going to make it easier for them to watch me through the windows. Sitting in the dark, listening to my own breathing, I could hear it more clearly than the night before. Slow steps in the leaves. A pause. Then another step. Whoever it was, they were circling closer this time. At one point, I heard the scrape of something against the porch railing. Wood against metal, slow and deliberate. My throat went dry. Max lunged at the door with a snarl that rattled through the cabin, and for a moment everything outside went silent again. My heart slammed so hard I could feel it in my neck. Hours passed like that. Bursts of sound, then silence. I didn't sleep at all. By the time morning came, I was done. I shoved everything back into my bag, barely even folding things, and loaded the car. Max didn't stop pacing until he was in the passenger seat, whining softly. When I drove down the dirt road, every shadow looked like a figure standing still among the trees. About halfway back to the highway, I stopped at a gas station. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up when I came in, but I noticed a flyer tacked to the wall near the door. It had a grainy photo of a man, mid-30s maybe, dark hair, a crooked smile. The words "wanted for assault" were printed in bold across the top. My stomach turned when I saw the date. It was only 2 weeks old. The last known sighting had been just 20 miles from the cabin. I didn't stay long. I filled the tank, grabbed coffee with a shaking hand, and got back in the car. As I pulled onto the main road, Max rested his head in my lap, finally calmer now that we were leaving it all behind. I didn't tell anyone the full story when I got home. I just said I cut the trip short, that the cabin was too quiet, too empty. But I never forgot the sound of those footsteps in the leaves, circling closer in the dark. And I knew one thing for certain. Whoever had been out there wasn't some lost hiker or curious hunter. They had been watching, and they had gotten close enough to touch the porch. I still remember the year clearly because of how strange and exhausting it turned out to be. It was the summer of 2004, and I had just turned 32. I wanted a break from the noise of the city, so I drove out to a remote part of northern Michigan where I had rented a small wooden cabin. It wasn't much. 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and an old wood stove. But I told myself I only needed peace and quiet for a week. The drive up there took most of the day. The roads narrowed the deeper I went into the woods, and by the time I got close to the cabin, the paved road turned into a single dirt path with weeds growing tall on either side. The rental company had warned me that there was no cell service, but I didn't think much of it. Back then, being disconnected didn't feel as dangerous as it does now. The cabin sat in a small clearing. The roof sagged a little, and the wood was grayed from years of rain and sun. The porch creaked under my boots as I unlocked the door. Inside, it smelled of dust and pine. The air felt heavy, like the place hadn't been opened in a while. I unpacked slowly, trying to shake off the long drive. The first day passed without anything unusual. I went for a short walk around the woods, cooked a simple meal, and sat on the porch until it got dark. The silence at night was heavier than I expected. In the city, even at 2 a.m., there's always a hum, cars in the distance, someone shouting, the sound of life carrying on. Out there, it was only crickets, and occasionally, the sound of branches snapping somewhere deeper in the forest. By the second night, I started to notice things that didn't sit right. The first was the lock on the cabin door. It was flimsy, just a simple latch that could have been forced open with one good shove. I remember lying in bed, staring at the dark outline of that door, and realizing how easy it would be for anyone or anything to come inside. I told myself it was paranoia, the adjustment to isolation. On the third morning, I went outside to get some air and noticed something strange in the dirt about 20 feet from the cabin. Footprints. At first, I thought they might have been mine from when I walked around earlier, but these were larger and heavier. They came from the woods, circled near the cabin, then disappeared back into the trees. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe a hunter had passed by or a hiker, but the prints were fresh, pressed deep into the soft soil from rain the night before. I didn't see anyone around, and I hadn't heard a thing. The idea of someone walking so close to me while I was inside unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside put me on edge. Around midnight, I heard a steady crunch of footsteps in the brush. They weren't fast or panicked, just slow and deliberate, like someone walking without trying to hide. The steps stopped just beyond the tree line. I held my breath, waiting, straining to hear more. After what felt like forever, the sound faded away. The next morning, I debated leaving early, but pride and stubbornness made me stay. I told myself I was overreacting. I decided to keep busy, chopping wood, tidying the cabin, and writing in a notebook I had brought. I tried to convince myself that whoever it was, if there even was someone, had probably moved on. On the 5th day, I found more signs. The footprints were back, this time closer to the porch. The prints led to the steps but didn't go up them. I also noticed the handle on the back window looked different, slightly bent, like someone had tried to pry it open. My chest tightened as I stood there staring at it. I felt exposed, like the woods weren't sheltering me anymore but hiding someone else. That night was the longest of my life. I moved a chair against the door and kept a heavy piece of firewood beside my bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the cabin walls. It wasn't an animal scurrying, it was heavier, steady. Then I heard the soft creak of the porch. My throat went dry. Whoever it was stood there for several minutes. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, or maybe it was just my ears ringing from the silence. Then the boards creaked again as they left. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the first light hit the trees, I packed my things and loaded them into the car. My hands shook the entire time. I didn't even eat breakfast. The dirt path out of there felt endless, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods and block the road. When I reached the nearest town, I stopped at a gas station. The woman behind the counter looked at me strangely, probably because I looked pale and hadn't shaved in days. I asked if people ever camped or hiked near that area. She shook her head and said most locals avoided those woods because hunters sometimes set traps out there, and a few people had gone missing in the past. I didn't tell her what happened. I didn't want to sound crazy, and honestly, I wasn't even sure how much of it I believed myself. But I know what I heard. I know the prints were real, the bent window latch was real, the creaking on the porch was real. I drove home that same day and never went back. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. Every creak of my apartment building made me think of that cabin porch. I would wake up in the middle of the night and check the locks over and over again. Looking back, I don't think it was random. Whoever was out there had been watching me, circling closer each night, maybe waiting for me to fall into a routine or let my guard down. I left before they decided to make a move, and that decision probably saved me. The cabin rental company sent me an email months later asking for feedback. I deleted it without replying. I never told them what happened. I figured they wouldn't care, or worse, they'd think I made it up. But I know the truth. I wasn't alone in those woods. Someone had been out there, studying me in the silence, and the only reason I'm able to write this now is because I left when I did. I was 32 years old the summer I decided to spend a week alone in the mountains of Montana with my dog, Duke. It was 1998, and I had been working long hours in construction back in the city. My body was sore, my mind was restless, and I needed space away from everything. A friend of mine had told me about an old hunting cabin his uncle used years ago. He said it wasn't in the best condition, but it had 4 walls, a roof, and was far enough from the main road that I'd have all the quiet I wanted. The drive out there took me most of the day. The roads grew narrower the further I went, until finally I was just on dirt paths lined with tall pines that swayed with the wind. My old pickup truck rattled with every bump, and Duke sat in the passenger seat with his head out the window, tongue lolling, ears flapping. The sound of gravel crunching under the tires mixed with the occasional call of birds overhead. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was dipping low, turning the tops of the trees gold. The place was rougher than I expected. The wood siding was gray and weathered, the roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were streaked with years of dust and rain. A short set of steps led to the door, which looked like it had been patched together more than once. Inside, it smelled like old wood, mildew, and dust. The floor creaked under my boots. There was one small room with a cot against the wall, a cast iron stove in the corner, and a wooden table with 2 chairs. A few shelves still held rusty cans and jars, but I wasn't going to risk eating anything that had been sitting there for who knows how many years. I set my bag down, unrolled my sleeping bag on the cot, and gave Duke some water and food before I sat down to take in the silence. That night, the silence wasn't as comforting as I thought it would be. Every crack of the wood, every rustle of leaves outside carried through the thin walls. Duke paced a few times before lying near the door, his head resting on his paws. I trusted his instincts, so as long as he was calm, I forced myself to relax. Still, I didn't sleep deeply. The next day was quiet. I chopped some firewood behind the cabin, gathered water from the creek about 50 yards away, and explored the trails nearby. The forest was thick, the ground soft with pine needles, and the air cooler than in the city. Duke stayed close, sometimes running ahead but always circling back to check on me. By evening, I was sore from the work but felt good. I made a small fire in the stove and ate a simple meal while Duke dozed by my feet. On the third night, a storm rolled in. I heard the wind building before it arrived, whistling through the trees, rattling branches against the roof. Rain came down in steady sheets, drumming on the old wood. The sound was constant, making the walls feel even thinner. Duke sat up, ears perked, staring at the door. The sound of the storm masked everything else, so it was hard to tell if he heard something or if he was just uneasy from the noise. I got up, checked the windows, and made sure the door was latched. The storm raged for hours. Lightning lit up the room through the cracks in the window frame, followed by rolling thunder that seemed to shake the ground. Around midnight, I thought I heard something else. Not the storm, not the trees, but something heavier, like a footstep in the mud outside. Duke growled low in his throat, his body stiff. I stood still, listening, every muscle tight. I told myself it could be a branch falling or an animal moving close to the cabin. Bears, deer, and even moose roamed the area. But the sound came again, slow, deliberate, not random. A crunch of wet ground, then nothing. Then another, closer this time. Duke was at the door now, hackles raised, teeth showing in the dim light. I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. I stayed awake the rest of that night, sitting on the cot with a hatchet in my hand. The storm eventually moved on, the rain easing into a light drizzle. When dawn broke, I stepped outside with Duke. The ground was soaked, and the air smelled of wet pine and earth. That's when I saw them, footprints in the mud, leading up to the side of the cabin and stopping just below the window. They were boot prints, clear and deep, made by someone heavy. They weren't mine, and they weren't fresh from the storm. They had been made while the rain still poured, edges softened by water but still visible. Cold knot formed in my stomach. Someone had been there, watching. I scanned the trees, but the forest was silent, damp, and still. Duke kept sniffing around the tracks, whining softly. Whoever it was, they had left before daylight. I thought about leaving right then, throwing my bag in the truck and heading back to the city. But the cabin was deep in the mountains, and part of me didn't want to be scared off so easily. I convinced myself it was probably just a hunter passing through, curious about the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of someone standing outside in the rain, staring in through the window. The next night, I barely slept. Every sound outside had me on edge. Duke stayed restless too, moving from the door to the window and back again. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Movement outside, slow, steady, circling the cabin. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I held the hatchet tight, eyes fixed on the door, every sense straining. The footsteps stopped for long minutes, then shifted to the other side of the cabin. Duke growled, deep and angry, teeth bared. Then silence. Long, heavy silence. I waited, not moving, until the first light of dawn crept through the window. When I stepped outside, the ground told the story again. Boot prints in the mud, circling the cabin, close to the door, close to the windows. They weren't mine. That was enough for me. I packed everything into the truck that morning, barely eating. Duke jumped in the passenger seat, still tense, ears twitching at every sound in the woods. As I drove away, the forest closed around us, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. When I reached the main road, relief washed over me, but the unease never fully left. Someone had been out there in the storm, watching my cabin, circling it night after night. I didn't know what they wanted, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I never went back to that cabin again. Years later, I still remember those nights. The sound of footsteps in the mud, the way Duke bristled and growled at something I couldn't see, the clear prints outside the windows. It wasn't ghosts or anything supernatural. It was real, and that's what made it worse. Someone was out there, close enough to touch the walls I was sleeping behind, choosing not to knock, not to speak, just to wait and watch. And that's the kind of fear that stays with you forever. It was in the autumn of 1997 when I decided I was finally going to build myself a small cabin. I was 27 years old, tired of the city, tired of the traffic, the noise, and the constant feeling that I was never alone. I had bought a little plot of land in the northern part of Washington state, tucked between a line of thick pine trees and a sloping hill that overlooked a narrow creek. The land wasn't much, just under 2 acres, but it was mine, and I had made up my mind that I would build something with my own hands, no matter how rough it turned out. That day had started with a gray sky, the kind that looks heavy, like it's waiting to crush everything underneath it with rain. I had been working since morning, cutting lumber I had brought in the back of my old Ford, sweating through my shirt even though the air was damp and chilly. The smell of wet soil was everywhere, and the grass clung to my boots every time I stepped. By late afternoon, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees, and I could hear branches rattling high above me. I knew rain was coming, but I wanted to get at least the walls of the cabin framed before it fell. By the time I got the first section of the frame standing, the drizzle had started. It was light at first, just a mist, but soon the drops grew heavier, tapping on the metal roof of my truck and soaking through my jacket. I didn't stop. I hammered nails with rain running down my face, my hands numb from the cold, and every time I looked around, the woods seemed darker and thicker, as if the storm was swallowing up the light. I finally gave in as the downpour came, turning the dirt into slick mud that pulled at my boots. My tools were getting slippery, and I knew if I kept swinging that hammer with wet hands, I'd end up smashing my thumb. I gathered everything I could carry and dragged it under the half-finished frame. It wasn't much shelter, just upright boards with a crossbeam, but it was enough to keep me a little drier than out in the open. I sat there, water dripping off the brim of my cap, listening to the storm. The sound of rain in the forest is different from rain in the city. It's heavier, louder, like thousands of little drums pounding on leaves, branches, and earth all at once. The creek nearby had risen fast, rushing louder than usual, like it was angry. I could smell pine and wet dirt so strong it almost stung my nose. My stomach growled, and I realized I hadn't eaten since early morning, but the thought of walking back to the truck through that downpour felt miserable. When night came, it wasn't gradual. One moment there was a dim gray light, the next it was pitch black, except for the occasional flash of lightning that lit up the whole clearing. Each strike made the trees look like black skeletons, sharp and twisted, and every shadow seemed alive for that split second. The thunder followed close behind, shaking through my chest and making the ground tremble under me. I sat with my back against one of the beams, trying to stay calm, but the rain kept slamming harder on the wood around me. The mud under me was cold and soaking through my jeans. My fingers were stiff, and I could barely feel them anymore. I thought about climbing into the truck and waiting the storm out, but the path had already turned into a mess of water and deep ruts. If I tried to drive out in the dark, I'd end up stuck. So I stayed under the frame, telling myself it was only one night, that the storm would pass by morning. But as the hours dragged, the storm didn't ease. The wind grew stronger, pushing against the boards I had nailed together. At times, it felt like the whole frame would be torn out of the ground. Branches snapped and crashed somewhere out in the woods, each one sounding closer than the last. I clenched my jaw and waited, every nerve on edge, staring into the dark while the rain poured down. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees during a lightning flash. Just a quick blur, like something darting from one trunk to another. My heart slammed in my chest. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks, the wind tossing branches around. But my eyes kept searching the tree line anyway. Every noise sounded sharper, something cracking, something dragging. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, listening to the creek roar and the rain pound harder and harder. Hours felt like days. My legs were shaking from the cold. My back hurt from pressing into the wood. My stomach twisted with hunger. The rain plastered my hair to my forehead, and I could taste mud when water splashed into my mouth. The thought of being completely alone out here sank in deeper with every minute. No one knew exactly where I was. No one would come looking tonight. Around midnight, another crash echoed, this time closer, right on the edge of the clearing. I jerked up, staring into the dark. Another flash of lightning lit everything for a second, and I saw a large pine, split down the middle, crashing into the mud only 20 yards from where I sat. The thunder followed instantly, so loud it hurt my ears. My chest was still pounding when I realized just how close I had been to being crushed. After that, I couldn't sit still anymore. I crawled out from under the frame and made my way toward the truck, slipping in the mud with every step. The rain soaked me completely, cold cutting through to the bone, but I kept moving. The lightning showed me the way, each strike revealing the shape of my truck in the clearing. When I finally reached it, I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. The inside smelled like damp leather and old metal, but it felt like safety compared to the open ground. I leaned back in the seat, shivering so hard my teeth rattled. Water dripped off me onto the floorboards. I pulled an old blanket from the back and wrapped it tight, curling up as the storm raged outside. The sound of rain on the roof of the truck was deafening, but it was steadier now, less chaotic than out in the open. My eyes kept flicking to the tree line through the foggy glass, waiting for movement, but nothing came. I stayed like that until dawn, half asleep, half terrified, listening to the storm slowly die down. By morning, the rain had thinned to a drizzle, and the air smelled fresh and sharp, like the whole forest had been washed clean. My cabin frame was still standing, though leaning slightly from the wind. The ground was torn up, branches scattered everywhere, puddles deep enough to swallow my boots. I sat there for a while, staring at the mess, realizing how close the night had come to being worse. A little more wind, and the frame could have crushed me. That falling pine could have ended me without warning. The forest doesn't care if you're ready or not. It doesn't care if you've eaten, if you're cold, or if you're building something you're proud of. It just moves, and you have to find a way to live with it. That morning, I climbed out of the truck, soaked and sore, and I knew one thing with perfect clarity. I wasn't going to give up on the cabin. The storm had made it clear how dangerous and unforgiving the land could be, but it also showed me I could survive it, even if I was alone. I picked up my hammer again, mud sucking at my boots, and I kept building. The fear from that night stayed with me, though. Every time I hammered another nail or set another beam, I remembered the sound of the rain pounding down, the tree splitting, the way the lightning lit up the clearing like a snapshot of chaos. And I promised myself that when the cabin was finished, it wouldn't just be a place to sit. It would be strong, safe, and ready for whatever storm the forest wanted to throw at me next. I had been hunting since I was young, but I never spent much time alone in the woods overnight. That changed in the fall of 1996 when I decided to spend a long weekend in a small cabin I rented deep in the mountains of northern Montana. I was 28 at the time, working as a mechanic, and I wanted nothing more than a few days away from people, noise, and work. The cabin was built in the late 60s, old but sturdy, with thick wooden beams and a stone fireplace. It was the kind of place that looked like it belonged in the woods, worn but dependable. The drive there took almost 5 hours, the last stretch being a narrow dirt road that wound through pine trees so thick the sunlight barely touched the ground. The cabin stood at the end of a clearing, facing a slope that dropped into the tree line. Behind it, a ridge climbed steep and rocky. I remember stepping out of the truck and hearing nothing but the faint sound of wind in the branches. No cars, no voices, not even the sound of an airplane overhead. It was quiet in a way that made me feel both calm and uneasy. Inside, the cabin was basic but comfortable. One main room with a small kitchen on one side, a table, 2 chairs, and a couch facing the fireplace. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. The walls were rough wood, and the place smelled faintly of pine mixed with old smoke. On the table, I found a guest book left by the owner. A few people had signed their names, some notes about good hunting or weather, but the last entry was from almost 8 months before. That didn't surprise me. The place was remote, and winters up here were brutal. I unloaded my gear, set my rifle in the corner, and stacked firewood inside. By evening, I had a fire going, and I sat outside on the porch as the sun went down, the sky turning orange behind the ridge. The woods grew darker by the minute, and the silence deepened. When the stars finally came out, they looked sharper and brighter than anything I saw back in town. That first night was uneventful. I slept lightly, waking a few times to the creaking of the cabin or the snap of branches outside. But that was expected. Old buildings make noises, and forests are full of animals. In the morning, I brewed coffee on the small propane stove, packed a day bag, and headed out to hunt. The day passed quickly. I tracked deer through the valley below the cabin, spotted a few but never got close enough for a clean shot. I walked several miles, keeping track of the trails so I wouldn't lose my way. The air was crisp, the ground damp with old leaves, and the woods smelled like earth and resin. By the time I returned to the cabin, it was near dusk again, and I was tired from hiking. That night, things began to feel different. I was sitting inside with the fire burning low when I heard something outside. At first, it was faint, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, listening. Then it came again, slower, heavier. Not the light, quick steps of a deer, but something that pressed down hard with weight. My first thought was a bear. The area was known for them. I got up, grabbed my rifle, and stood near the window. The sound stopped. I couldn't see anything in the dark beyond the porch, but the silence felt heavier now, like the woods were holding their breath. I stayed awake later than I planned, listening. At some point, I must have dozed off in the chair because I woke with the fire almost out, cold creeping into the room. Everything was quiet again, so I added wood, checked the lock on the door, and went to bed. The next morning, I noticed something strange near the edge of the clearing. About 30 feet from the cabin, the ground was disturbed, like someone or something had walked in circles. The leaves were crushed, the soil churned up. It wasn't a single set of tracks, but a patch of ground worn down in a rough shape, almost like pacing. I crouched and looked closer, expecting to see paw prints or hooves, but the marks were uneven, blurred. They could have been boots or just as easily an animal dragging itself through. It was hard to tell. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. I hunted again that day but couldn't focus. Every snapped branch behind me made me turn. The forest no longer felt empty, felt watched. I cut my trip shorter than planned, heading back by mid-afternoon. That evening, as I sat on the porch, I thought I saw movement at the tree line, a shadow shifting between the trunks, too far away to make out clearly. My pulse hammered, but I forced myself to stay seated, telling myself it was just an animal. After a while, I went inside and barred the door. That night was worse. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It was the door handle rattling. Slow at first, then harder, as if someone was testing it. My chest tightened. I reached for my rifle, keeping quiet, not daring to move more than I had to. The rattling stopped, followed by silence so complete I could hear my own breathing. Minutes crawled by. Then I heard footsteps again, this time circling the cabin. The boards of the porch creaked under the weight. I sat frozen, rifle aimed at the door, finger trembling near the trigger. Whoever or whatever was out there moved slowly, deliberately, making a full loop around the cabin. Then nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I stepped outside, rifle ready. The clearing was empty, but the ground told a different story. More tracks, clearer this time. They were human, boots, not animal prints. Dozens of them circling the cabin, stopping near the windows, near the door. My stomach turned cold. Someone had been out here with me. I packed up fast, threw my gear into the truck without even eating breakfast. The woods felt too quiet again, but this time it wasn't calming. Felt like something was waiting. I got in the truck, started it, and drove down the dirt road without looking back. As I hit the main road, I realized how isolated that cabin truly was. No neighbors for miles, no phone lines, no help if someone decided to come back at night and break in. I thought about the ground outside, worn down by someone pacing, circling, waiting. I never told the owner what happened. I just mailed the keys back and never rented the place again. To this day, I don't know who was out there in the woods with me or what they wanted. But I know this, it wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was someone who walked on 2 feet, circling my cabin all night, rattling the door, standing just outside the glass. And that thought has stayed with me longer than anything else from that trip. I was 31 years old when I decided to take a short trip to the mountains in late October of 2016. I had been working long hours at my job in Manchester and felt worn out. I wanted a quiet place where I could spend a few days alone, clear my head, and enjoy the cold air before winter fully settled in. I booked a small cabin outside of Fort William in Scotland. It was remote, tucked into the trees, a place where I wouldn't be bothered by anything but the sound of the wind through the pines. The drive up was long, around 5 hours, and by the time I reached the dirt road that led toward the cabin, the daylight was already fading. The cabin itself sat at the edge of a clearing. It wasn't large, just 1 story with a small front porch, 2 rooms inside, and a narrow kitchen at the back. The wood was weathered and dark, the windows slightly fogged over from the cool air inside. The place smelled faintly of damp wood and smoke, the kind of smell old cabins always carry. I unpacked my bag, set it on the small wooden bed, and laid out some food I'd brought with me. I had a torch, extra batteries, a camping stove, and enough groceries for 3 days. My plan was simple: stay put, go for a few walks during the day, and spend the evenings reading and resting. The first night passed quietly. The cabin walls creaked in the wind, and the sound of branches brushing against the roof kept me awake longer than I expected, but nothing unusual happened. The second day, I hiked for a couple of hours along a trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. The air was sharp, carrying the smell of wet leaves and earth. I saw deer tracks near a stream and noticed a few hunting blinds scattered further in. It reminded me that I wasn't the only person who ever came into these woods. By the 3rd evening, things began to feel different. I was sitting on the porch as the light drained from the sky, sipping from a metal cup of tea. The clearing around the cabin was dim, the tree line casting long shadows. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Near the edge of the trees, maybe 30 yards away, there was a shape, someone standing very still. It wasn't clear at first. The trees and the low light made it hard to tell, but as my eyes adjusted, I could see the outline of a person. They weren't moving, just facing in my direction. I stayed seated, my body tense. I didn't want to call out, didn't want to acknowledge them. The air felt colder all of a sudden, or maybe that was just my nerves. I stared back at the figure, waiting for them to step forward or turn away. Instead, they simply stood there, motionless. After what felt like minutes, I blinked, and when I looked again, the space between the trees was empty. I told myself I had imagined it. My eyes were tired, the shadows had played tricks. I forced myself inside, locked the door, and tried to distract my thoughts with a book. Still, my mind kept going back to that dark outline. Later that night, I woke to a sound. It wasn't loud, but sharp enough to snap me out of sleep. It came from outside, from the porch area. It was the sound of wood creaking under weight, like someone stepping slowly across it. I stayed frozen in bed, my ears straining. There it was again, the faint pressure of a footstep. I reached quietly for my torch but didn't turn it on. My breathing felt too loud. For several minutes, I lay there in the dark, listening. Eventually, the sound stopped and silence filled the cabin again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I stepped outside cautiously. The porch boards did creak when I stepped on them, just as they had in the night. I scanned the clearing, looking for tracks. The ground was damp from the night air, and sure enough, I saw them. Shoe prints, not mine, pressed into the soft dirt leading around the side of the cabin. They weren't animal prints, they were clearly from boots. I crouched down, studying them. They came up to the porch and then circled back out toward the trees. My stomach churned. Someone had been there, and not by accident. The day passed in a blur. I kept checking the tree line, half expecting to see someone again. I forced myself to eat and tried to plan what I would do. I thought about leaving early, but the road back was rough and long, and it was already midday. I told myself if I just made it through one more night, I could pack up and leave in the morning. When evening came, I lit the small lantern inside and sat at the table with my back to the wall, where I could see both the front window and the door. My ears picked up every noise, the rustle of leaves, the distant cracking of branches. Around midnight, it happened again. A sound outside, closer this time. I killed the lantern and sat in the dark, holding my torch but not turning it on. My heart was racing so hard I could feel it in my throat. There was movement on the porch again, slow and deliberate. Then the soft scrape of metal against the door handle. Someone was trying it, testing it. I gripped the torch tighter, my hands sweating. The door was locked, but I knew it was just a thin piece of wood. I pictured it being kicked open. After a few seconds, the sound stopped. Silence again, long and heavy. I stayed awake, not daring to move. I must have sat in that chair until the first light of dawn began to creep through the window. When I finally opened the door in the morning, my worst fear was confirmed. The handle bore scratches, fresh ones, like someone had been working at it with a knife or tool. The prints were back too, circling the cabin in uneven patterns. Whoever had been out there wasn't just wandering. They were watching, waiting. I didn't bother eating breakfast. I packed my things fast, shoving clothes into my bag, throwing supplies together. My only thought was to leave. As I carried my bag to the car, I kept glancing at the trees. It felt like eyes were still on me, hidden behind the branches. The dirt road was rough, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped out of there. Every turn of the road, I expected to see someone step out, blocking my way, but no one did. Only when I hit the main road back toward the town did I finally feel some relief. That night, In a hotel room far from the cabin, I finally let myself breathe. I didn't sleep much, though. My mind kept replaying the sound of the porch boards under someone's weight, the marks on the door handle, the still figure at the tree line. It was no trick of shadows, no stretch of imagination. Someone had been out there, circling that cabin while I was inside. I left early, and I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't. But I know for certain that if I'd stayed one more night, the lock wouldn't have held. I never went back to that part of Scotland again. Even now, years later, when I hear would creak at night or a door handle rattle faintly, I remember that cabin, and I remember how close I came to learning exactly what was waiting for me out there. I was 28 years old the first time I stumbled across the old cabin in the woods of northern Maine. It was late October of 1997, one of those weeks where the trees had already dropped most of their leaves, and the air carried a constant damp chill. I had driven out there to hunt, though truthfully I spent more time wandering the woods than actually carrying my rifle properly. I had taken a week off work, wanting to get away from the steady hum of the city, and I thought some solitude would do me good. That morning had started out with frost on the ground, the grass stiff and white until the sun finally reached it. I had been walking for hours, following a barely visible trail of deer prints through wet leaves, when I noticed something out of place in the thick trees ahead. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a dark shape, but as I got closer, I realized it was an old structure. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and one side of it seemed to tilt inward, as if the forest itself had been slowly crushing it for decades. The cabin sat in a small clearing, almost swallowed by the woods. The grass around it had grown tall and wild, and a layer of leaves piled against the base of the walls. There were no tire tracks, no paths, nothing to suggest that anyone had been near it in years. The windows were broken out in places, the glass long since fallen into the dirt, and the wooden door was swollen with rot. I should have turned away right there. I had no reason to go in. But there's a strange pull that abandoned places have on you, and once you see them, it's hard not to wonder what's inside. I walked up the creaking steps, testing each one with my weight, and pushed the door open. It groaned against the frame, scraping along the floor before swinging inward. The air inside was cold and smelled of damp wood and mold. Dust hung in the slanted beams of light that came through the cracks in the roof. A table sat just to the left, its surface warped and gray, with a rusted coffee pot still resting in the center as if someone had once set it down and never returned for it. There was a small wood stove near the back, its pipe running up through the ceiling, but it was caked in rust and filled with old ash. What unsettled me most was the silence. The woods outside had been full of small sounds. Wind shifting leaves, birds moving through branches. But inside that cabin it felt sealed off from everything. I stood there for a while, letting my eyes adjust, scanning the corners. There were signs that someone had once lived there, though it must have been decades earlier. A mattress frame leaned crooked against the wall. A set of shelves held a few glass jars, the contents unrecognizable, clouded and spoiled. In the corner near the window, I noticed a pair of boots, cracked with age, one slumped over the other. I took a few steps deeper inside, careful where I placed my feet because the floor sagged in spots. That's when I noticed something strange. On the far wall opposite the door, the wood looked newer. The boards didn't match the rest of the cabin. They were nailed in rough and uneven, as if someone had patched a hole quickly. The nails themselves weren't rusted like the others. I walked closer, feeling that uneasy weight in my chest. The wall didn't just look newer, it looked like it had been sealed up intentionally. I ran my hand across the boards. They were solid, colder than the rest of the wall. I didn't know why, but I had the sudden urge to leave, to just walk back out the way I came. Instead, I crouched down to look along the floor where the boards met the old wall. That's when I saw deep scratches in the wood, long marks carved into the floor, leading toward the sealed section. They weren't the kind of marks made by tools. They looked uneven, jagged, like something or someone had clawed at the floor in desperation. I stood up quickly, my throat dry, and turned back toward the door. For a second, I thought I heard something faint behind me, a creak of wood shifting where I hadn't stepped. I froze, listening. Nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. I left the cabin and stepped back out into the clearing, grateful for the cold air filling my lungs again. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. All the way back to where I had parked my truck miles away, my mind kept going back to those scratches. They were too sharp in my memory, too real. That night, sitting in my small rented room in town, I thought about it more. Who had patched that wall? Why would they? And why did the floor bear marks like that? The next morning, against better judgment, I hiked back. The forest was damp again, the sky gray and heavy. When I reached the cabin, I walked inside with a heavier step, determined to check that wall more closely. I brought a small flashlight this time, and when I shined it across the boards, I saw the faint outline of old stains at the edges. The wood around the nails was darker, as if something had seeped through. I set my pack down and started pulling at the boards. They were wedged tight, but with enough force, one of them loosened and splintered. The smell that came out was sour and thick, the kind of smell that made my stomach lurch instantly. I gagged, dropping the board to the floor. Behind the wall was a narrow, hidden space, like a shallow crawl area. And inside that space, collapsed against the wall, was what was left of a body. The clothes were still clinging to the skeleton, dark flannel and jeans stiff with age. The boots were there too, matching the pair I had seen by the window. The bones were yellowed and brittle, slumped in an unnatural angle. And the scratches on the floor made sense now. Whoever it was had been alive when they were walled in. I backed away, nearly tripping over the broken board. My flashlight shook in my hand as I aimed it back into that hidden space. There was no question about what I was seeing. It wasn't an accident. Someone had sealed this person inside that wall and left them there. I stumbled out of the cabin, my heart hammering so hard it made my vision blur. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods near the road. That night I drove back home, hours away, not caring that I had left behind my hunting trip, my gear, all of it. It took me 3 days before I finally called the sheriff's department in that county. I gave them the location as best I could and told them what I had found. They asked questions I didn't want to answer, but eventually they sent people out there. Weeks later, I read in a small local paper that the remains had been confirmed as belonging to a man who had gone missing in the late 1960s. They never charged anyone, never found enough evidence to prove who had done it. Just another cold case in a forgotten county. But I can still see the scratches on that floor every time I close my eyes. And what keeps me awake some nights is the thought that someone, at some point, had stood where I stood in that cabin, hammer in hand, sealing those boards shut while a man was still alive behind them. That's not something you forget. I was 32 years old when I decided to take a week alone in a rented hunting cabin in northern New Mexico. It was the summer of 2012, though up there, the nights always felt colder than summer should. I had been working in construction at the time and needed a break from the noise, traffic, and constant phone calls. The cabin was cheap, basic, and tucked deep into a stretch of land surrounded by scrub, thin pines, and jagged hills. It wasn't the sort of place that had a paved road leading to it, just a narrow, bumpy track you could easily miss if you weren't looking for it. The place itself was small, built from weathered logs that had grayed under the sun. A single-room space with a stove, a rough wooden table, and a cot pressed against the wall. There was no electricity, just a rusted kerosene lamp hanging from a nail, and no running water aside from a metal pump outside. The smell inside was old, like damp wood, dust, and mouse droppings. I told myself it was all part of the experience. I was there for the quiet. The first couple of days passed the way I wanted. I hiked, cooked simple meals on the stove, and sat outside as the sun dropped behind the ridges, turning the land a rusty red. But once night came, the silence was thicker than anything I was used to. In the city, even late at night, you can hear a car, a dog barking, or somebody's music leaking through a wall. Out there was nothing, just my breathing and the sound of wind pressing against the cabin walls. On the third night, I noticed something strange. I was sitting by the pump filling a pot with water when I saw movement at the edge of the scrub line. It was far off, but I could see the shape of something standing there, thin, upright, almost too still. I thought it might be a deer, but the way it held itself didn't look right. His body seemed angled oddly, like it was trying to balance. I stood there staring for longer than I should have, waiting for it to move. When it finally did, it stepped sideways into the brush in a jerky motion, and then it was gone. I shook it off, told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks, and carried the pot back inside. That night, I barely slept. Every time the wind rattled the cabin, I sat up. I thought about that figure, that stillness. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like scratching at the side of the cabin, low to the ground, faint but deliberate. I held my breath, staring at the door, listening. The scratching lasted a few minutes, then stopped. I told myself it was just a raccoon or a stray coyote nosing around. But when I stepped outside the next morning, the dirt beside the cabin had prints I couldn't make sense of. They weren't quite animal and weren't quite human either. The heel looked long, almost stretched, but there were claw-like marks at the front. I crouched there, staring at them, my stomach tight, and then forced myself to walk away. By the fourth night, I felt unsettled enough to keep the kerosene lamp burning longer than usual. I stayed at the table, staring at the weak light flickering on the log walls. Around 1 in the morning, I heard footsteps circling the cabin. Slow, heavy, deliberate steps, pausing every few seconds like whoever or whatever it was listening for me. I stayed perfectly still, heart hammering in my chest. The steps circled twice before fading off toward the pump. Then came the sound of water splashing, as if something was pumping it up. At that point, I didn't know if I should leave in the middle of the night or stay put. I thought about packing my bag, walking back down the dirt track with only my flashlight, but I couldn't force myself out the door. It felt safer to stay inside. I sat against the cot, holding the small hatchet I had brought for splitting kindling, waiting for daylight. The next morning, I found the pump handle damp and streaked with mud. There were more of those odd prints, circling the cabin, some pressed deep like something heavy had been pacing all night. My gut told me I wasn't imagining it. Something had been out there. I forced myself to carry on, making breakfast, tidying the space, pretending things were normal. But my hands kept shaking, and I dropped a cup, shattering it on the floor. That evening, I made the mistake of going for a short walk before the sun fully set. I told myself I'd stay close, just stretch my legs, and be back before dark. As I moved through the brush, I heard what I thought was a coyote calling in the distance. The sound was high and strained, but then it broke off in a way that didn't sound natural at all. A second later, it started again, but this time it was closer. Too close. It wasn't a coyote. It sounded like a person trying to mimic one, but the voice cracked, stretched, as if whoever was making it wasn't used to forming those noises. My legs went weak, and I hurried back to the cabin without looking behind me. That night was the worst. I barred the door with the table, set the hatchet beside me, and tried to stay awake. Around midnight, I heard my own name being called outside. My stomach dropped instantly. The voice was broken, rasping, as if someone had never said the word before but was forcing it out. It repeated, low at first, then louder, closer. My skin crawled. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loudly. Then came the scraping again, but this time higher, across the windowsill, slow and drawn out, like nails dragging on the wood. I knew then that something was trying to get in. Hours dragged by. I sat rigid in the dark, my eyes locked on the door. I swear I heard breathing just on the other side at one point, slow and steady, matching mine, as if it was waiting for me to move. Then silence. Finally, dawn crept in. The pale light cut across the floor, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe. When I stepped outside that morning, the ground was torn up with prints all around the cabin. Some looked like stretched human feet, some like animal paws, some twisted between the two. The pump was bent slightly, as if something had been pulling at it with unnatural force. I didn't wait. I stuffed everything into my pack, barely carrying what I left behind, and walked as fast as I could back to where I had parked. Every step I expected to hear footsteps behind me, but the land stayed silent. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was high, and the cabin was a dark speck far behind me. I drove away, heart pounding, never once looking back in the mirror. I didn't report anything, didn't tell the landowner. I just left. It's been years since then, but I still think about it every night when the house gets too quiet. I tell myself it could have been an animal, a drifter, or even my mind playing tricks. But when I close my eyes, I can still hear the way that voice tried to form my name, like it wasn't meant to come from a human throat. And I know I'll never set foot near a cabin in New Mexico again. I had rented a small cabin in the countryside of northern England, close to the edge of Northumberland National Park. It was the autumn of 2016, late September, when the days were short, the mornings wet with mist, and the nights colder than I expected. I was 32 then, living alone in Manchester, working long weeks in IT support. I needed a break from the screens and the noise of the city, so I booked the cabin for 4 nights, thinking I'd hike, read, and just let myself breathe. The cabin wasn't large. It sat on a narrow gravel lane that wound away from the main road, half a mile past a broken gate that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The structure itself was made of weathered wood, with green moss climbing up its back wall where the trees pressed close. Inside, it was basic but warm, 2 rooms, one with a small bed and dresser, the other with a wood stove, a sagging sofa, and a tiny kitchen counter with a single plug-in cooker. The nearest farmhouse was more than a mile away, and I hadn't seen a single person as I drove in. The first evening was quiet. The sky darkened early, and by 7:30 the woods outside had turned into a wall of black. I lit the stove and sat reading under a lamp, the silence broken only by the crack of firewood. I remember feeling relief, the kind you only notice when your body finally unwinds after months of pressure. But sometime past 9, while I was rinsing a mug at the sink, I glanced through the small square window above it. The glass was dirty, streaked with rainwater, but I thought I saw a pale figure near the tree line. I blinked hard, leaned closer, but by then it was gone, or maybe I had imagined it. I didn't think much of it until the next morning. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, the air damp and cold enough to sting my face. That's when I noticed footprints in the mud along the side of the cabin. They were faint but clear enough, long, narrow impressions, as if made by someone wearing thin shoes. They curved toward the back of the cabin and vanished where the ground hardened with roots and stones. I told myself it must have been an old trace left by a hiker, but the soil had been soaked from last night's rain. Those tracks couldn't have been more than a few hours old. I spent the day walking the trails near Kielder Forest, miles of pines that felt endless. The stillness was heavy out there, like even the birds were holding back. I didn't see a single hiker. When I got back in the late afternoon, the cabin looked different to me. Less like a retreat and more like an isolated box in the middle of nowhere. The footprints had been washed out by then, but the unease stayed with me. That night, it returned stronger. I was sitting by the stove again when I heard a faint rustle outside. Not like the wind in the leaves, but sharper, closer. I froze, listening. Came again, then a sound like a slow step on wet ground. My chest tightened. I turned off the lamp, leaving only the glow of the fire. The room dropped into shadow. Through the window, I could make out the outline of the trees, and in that dim view, I saw something, or rather, someone. A woman stood near the edge of the clearing. She was tall, with a thin frame, her clothes dark and loose. What struck me most was her face, or what little of it I could see. Pale skin, hollow features, and hair that looked stringy and unkempt. She didn't move, not even a twitch, just stood there facing the cabin. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour, but must have been minutes. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to shut the curtain. I didn't look again that night, but I hardly slept. Every creak of the cabin made me think she was circling outside, watching through the cracks. The next morning, I checked the clearing. There were new footprints, clearer this time, pressed deep into the mud just beyond the cabin. They trailed off into the woods. My stomach sank. This wasn't imagination. Someone had been there, standing only a few yards away. I thought about leaving that day, but I told myself I was overreacting. People walk these woods all the time, I reasoned, and maybe she was just a wanderer or even someone living rough out here. It wasn't illegal to pass by. I tried to calm myself with that logic, but it didn't erase the chill that followed me. On the third night, I made a mistake. I left the lamp on after dark, the curtains half open while I cooked. When I turned toward the window, I saw her again, closer this time, only a few meters from the glass. Her face was clearer under the weak light. Sunken eyes, jaw slightly slack, like she hadn't spoken in days. Her clothes were layered, torn in places, and I could see dirt caked on her hands. She stared directly at me, expressionless. I dropped the plate I was holding, the crash echoing through the cabin. By the time I forced myself to look back, she was gone. I rushed outside with a torch, but the beam caught only wet grass and trees. No sound of footsteps, no movement at all. That night I didn't sleep. I sat upright with the fire burning low, listening. Around 2 a.m, I heard it. The faint scrape of wood at the back of the cabin. My heart slammed in my chest. Then another sound, like fingers dragging along the siding. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited. It stopped after a few minutes, but I didn't dare check until sunrise. When daylight came, I went around the cabin. On the back wall, near the moss, I saw smudges. Not scratches from an animal, handprints. Faint, muddy marks, long and thin. That was it for me. I packed up everything in less than 15 minutes and loaded the car. I didn't even finish the booking. I just left. On the drive out, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see her walking down the lane behind me. Back in Manchester, I tried to put it behind me, but the image of her face, the stillness of her body, the way she stood in silence night after night, it stuck. I did some searching online, looking up missing persons in that region, wondering if she was someone who had been living rough or had wandered off. I never found anything certain, but I did come across old forum posts from hikers. Some mentioned spotting a lone woman in the woods around Kielder, always silent, always standing still, watching. None of them ever spoke to her, and no one seemed to know who she was. It's been years now, but I still see her when I close my eyes sometimes. Not moving, not speaking, just standing at the edge of the trees. I don't know what she wanted, or if she wanted anything at all. But I do know one thing. If I hadn't left that morning, if I had stayed just one more night in that cabin, I'm not sure I would have come back. I was 28 years old when I decided to spend a week alone at my uncle's old farm cabin in Nebraska. It was late September, 1997, and the fields around the cabin were half harvested, rows of corn stalks cut down, leaving sharp stubs sticking out of the ground like broken teeth. The cabin had been built in the late 1950s, weathered with siding faded gray from years of wind and sun. It sat back off a dirt road, about 2 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by acres of farmland that stretched flat in every direction. My uncle had stopped using it years before, after his health started to fail, but he let me borrow it whenever I needed to clear my head. At that time, I was tired of city noise and work stress, and I wanted silence. The cabin offered that, or at least I thought it would. The first day was quiet. I arrived in the morning carrying groceries and a sleeping bag. The cabin didn't have much inside. One old iron bed frame, a wooden table with uneven legs, 2 chairs, and a rusted stove that only worked if you fed it carefully split logs. I unpacked and opened the windows to let the stale air out. The smell inside was a mix of dust, dry wood, and something faintly metallic, maybe rust or old tools. The silence of the fields pressed in, broken only by the steady creaking of the windmill that stood about 50 yards from the cabin, its blades turning slow in the breeze. That first night, I slept deeply, the way you do when you're far from traffic and streetlights. But the second night was different. I had cooked some eggs and bread on the stove, cleaned the pan, and sat by the small window while the sun went down. The horizon was painted orange and purple, the fields glowing as the last lights sank away. By the time it was dark, the only sound was the windmill creaking, over and over, like a slow, heavy door being opened. I lay down on the bed with a lantern turned low beside me, and I tried to drift off. Sometime after midnight, I woke up, not to a sound exactly, but to the feeling that something had changed. The air felt heavier, the silence sharper. I listened carefully. The windmill was still turning, the faint squeak and groan of its blades cutting through the night. Then, under that, I caught it, another sound. It was soft, irregular, like dry stalks being stepped on. At first, I told myself it was just the wind brushing the corn that still stood in parts of the field. But the sound didn't move with the breeze. It had a weight to it, a rhythm, like someone walking slowly around the cabin. I lay frozen on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, counting the seconds between each step. Crunch, pause, crunch. The steps stopped at the far side of the cabin, near the kitchen wall. I didn't move. My chest hurt from holding my breath. After maybe a full minute, I heard it again, closer to the window. Crunch, then silence. I forced myself to sit up. The lantern light cast weak shadows across the room. I turned it up higher and looked at the window. Nothing, just the darkness of the field, the reflection of my own face in the glass. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a stray dog or a deer wandering too close. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. The ground was dry dirt and broken corn stubble, easy to show prints, but I didn't find anything clear. Just scattered marks that could have been from me unloading wood or walking around the day before. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of those heavy, deliberate steps. I spent the day cutting small logs for the stove and tried to distract myself. But by late afternoon, the unease returned. The fields looked endless, the cabin so small against the open land. When the sun dipped low again, I already felt my chest tightening with dread. That night, I kept the lantern burning brighter, hoping light would make me feel safer. Around midnight, it started again. Crunch, crunch. This time, the steps circled slower, dragging through the dirt. I gripped the handle of the hatchet I had brought in with me after splitting wood earlier. My palms were sweating so much I could barely hold it. The steps came right up to the porch and the boards creaked. Whoever or whatever it was stood there for a long time. I waited, staring at the door, half expecting the knob to turn. But nothing happened, just silence, followed by a long scrape, as if someone had dragged something sharp across the wood railing outside. I didn't sleep after that. When the first light of morning broke, I went out and checked the porch. My stomach dropped when I saw it. A long, thin scratch ran across the railing, cutting into the old wood. Not a random mark from years of weather, but fresh. It was too straight, too deliberate. By the fourth night, my nerves were shot. I debated packing up and leaving, but stubbornness kept me there. I told myself maybe it was kids messing around, though I had seen no cars, no lights, no sign of anyone for miles. I locked the door with the rusted latch, even though it wouldn't hold against much force. I pushed the table against it too. That night, the noises started earlier, just after dark. Crunch, crunch, circling again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. I heard faint tapping on the windows, one by one, moving around the cabin.
Top, top.
Then silence. Then another. I didn't move. My whole body was rigid, every sound amplified in my ears. The lantern light flickered as if the air itself was unsteady. Hours seemed to pass before it stopped. I must have dozed off sitting upright with the hatchet in my hands, because I woke with a start at dawn, stiff and aching. When I went outside, my heart nearly stopped. Around the cabin, drawn into the dirt, were small circles, uneven but clear, pressed into the ground like someone had walked in patterns, over and over, dragging their feet. The prints weren't animal. They were human, bare feet. I could see the toes. Some of the steps overlapped, as if whoever had done it had spent hours pacing in circles through the night. That was enough. I packed everything in a rush, barely stopping to eat. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror at the cabin shrinking behind me. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something stood just out of sight, watching me leave. I never went back after that. My uncle's cabin still stands, but I won't set foot there again. I know what I heard. I know what I saw carved into the porch, and I know those barefoot tracks weren't mine. Somebody had been out there night after night, circling, waiting. And the worst part isn't what they did, it's what they didn't do. They could have forced their way inside at any time, but they didn't. They just wanted me to know they were there,